Ladies and gentlemen, Coach Yasin here, and in this training, we're going to be talking about paraphrasing and verbal mirroring and exactly what those skills actually are. Super pumped for us to go ahead and dive right into this training here together today. And so inside of this training, we are continuing our theme of the art of transformation, and we are learning the skills to be an amazing coach who can influence and guide others through their transformation, as well as guide yourself through self-coaching. And so inside of this training, we are going to be talking about the fourth coaching skill, which is paraphrasing and verbal mirroring. Okay, so as always, very important during these things, Welcome to the elite club, because remember that less than 2% of the population has ever had any formal training in listening skills. And so what I'm telling you right now is that these trainings, as you learn these skills, are going to radically transform your life and the life of everyone else that you interact with for the rest of your life. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why these trainings are so valuable and so important, because not only are you going to apply them professionally, but they're also going to be implemented personally. And so that's why I am so excited for you to actually learn each of these skills. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop right into it. As always, we do have the training outline available for you for later reference. And so the very first question that we are going to go ahead and ask ourselves inside of this training is, hey, what the heck is this paraphrasing and verbal mirroring kind of thing? Okay, so if you remember, in the matching and mirroring training, we talked about rapport, right? We talked about the importance of rapport. We talked about why it's so critical and important both in life and in coaching. And we also talked about the 4 ways to build rapport. And we said that the 4 ways to build rapport are the same as the conscious listening process. And so we said, hey, we've already talked about conscious listening. We've already talked about curious exploration. At this point, we've already also talked about matching and mirroring. And so now inside of this training, we're continuing and learning more about the rapport process through the conscious listening process by talking about paraphrasing and verbal mirroring. Okay, so paraphrasing and verbal mirroring are also psychology principles that are very similar to matching and mirroring, but they have more to do with what we say, right? So if you remember, matching was more about what we do, the intangible, the in-between, but now that we're talking about paraphrasing and verbal mirroring, it's all about what we say. Because here's the thing about coaching. Coaching is kind of like a series of questions and reflection. So it's like, hey, I'm going to ask a question, and then we're going to go ahead and reflect. Question, reflect, question, reflect. And so paraphrasing and verbal mirroring is all about reflecting back to the student or the client what they actually just said. But now here's a question, okay? Now that we know a little bit about what paraphrasing and verbal mirroring is, it's not 100% clear for us, right? So let's go ahead and talk about the difference between paraphrasing and verbal mirroring, so that way we can understand this a little bit better. Because in most trainings, in most books, in most people that talk about these topics, most of the time they confuse them, they use them interchangeably, and they don't ever really delineate and show the difference between paraphrasing and verbal mirroring, okay? So in most trainings that talk about influence, coaching, and psychology, they will a lot of times bundle these two things together. But it's important to know that they are 2 different concepts. And so paraphrasing is about saying similar, the gist, the essence of what the other person just said. And then verbal mirroring is about saying exactly what the other person just said. Now, does that look familiar? Yes, because in some ways we can think of paraphrasing as being very similar to matching with the words that are being said, and verbal mirroring is very similar to mirroring, but with the words that were just said. Now, very important note, some people do confuse verbal mirroring with matching or vice versa, so I don't want you to get confused. And yes, it's true, verbal mirroring is basically mirroring like we talked about in the previous training, but specifically with words. And so yes, it is kind of like a subsection, depends on how you decide to organize it, but the point being is don't get confused about it. They're kind of like bundles, skills that go together, and so it's just important to know the difference between them. Okay, so in the same way that we talked about the difference between matching and mirroring, and we talked about how we typically in coaching use matching more than we use mirroring, inside of this training, I want to go ahead and differentiate as to why we actually use verbal mirroring more than we use paraphrasing. Okay, so it's very important to understand that verbal mirroring is not the same as paraphrasing, right? So when we verbal mirror, what we are doing is we're using the exact same words, the exact same keywords, the exact same phrases, the exact same tones that we hear the student as they were originally stated. And so the reason why this is important and the reason why we don't paraphrase is because when you use your own words and you start to summarize what the student said, instead of using the exact words that the student used, what you do is you diminish the importance of their words and the words that they use and the words that they chose to use, and you're assuming that your words carry the same meaning for the student. The truth is, they do not. And so let's go ahead and go through an example, and I want to show you why it's so important to differentiate between verbal mirroring and paraphrasing, and why we actually, in a coaching conversation, typically use verbal mirroring more often. So let's go ahead and go through an example, right? So let me show you what paraphrasing is going to look like. So the student says, hey, I hate it when my wife tells me that I should do the dishes right when I get home from work. And then the coach says, okay, so what I'm hearing you saying is that it stinks when your wife nags you to clean the kitchen. Do I have that right? And then the student says, no, I wouldn't say she nags me, right? That's paraphrasing, okay? That's how a paraphrasing conversation might end up. Versus verbal mirroring, the student says the same thing. Hey, I hate it when my wife tells me that I should do the dishes right when I get home from work, okay? And now the coach, in the same tone as the client, right, mirroring the client, is, okay, so what I'm hearing you saying is that you hate it when your wife tells you that you should do the dishes right when you get home from work. Do I have that right? You see how the coach used the exact same words as the student, as the client. The student would say yes. And so the student will get defensive when you insult their wife by saying that she nags him, right? And so a coach, a great coach, understands that I hate it when my wife tells me. That phrase is not the same as stinks when my wife nags me, right? Those are two very, very, very different ways. Even though they might have the same gist, some people might even mean the same thing. It's very important that we are not diminishing the words that the student is actually using and really trying to read into it or put words into their mouth. Very, very, very important, okay? So do you now see the difference between these two and why it's so important? This is why in coaching, we typically use verbal mirroring more than paraphrasing, because we don't want to get stuck in a situation in which we are actually diminishing the words of the student or the client. And so for that reason, in this training and what we mainly practice, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be talking more about verbal mirroring than we do paraphrasing, okay? However, even though we are talking about verbal mirroring more than paraphrasing, it is still important to know what paraphrasing is, that it does exist, and that it is closely related to verbal mirroring. Does that make sense? I hope that's very clear. Make sure you let us know if you do have any questions about this. Awesome. Now, what I want to go ahead and do after that point is, as we start to go ahead and talk more about what verbal mirroring and paraphrasing are, I want to go ahead and connect those two things to conscious listening, right? Because remember, paraphrasing and verbal mirroring is a part of the conscious listening process. And so they do work hand in hand with all of the other skills. All of these skills are tied together. And so just like we learned inside of the conscious listening training, we talked about how good listeners repeat back to the person what they said, right? Inside of that training, if you recall, we said that when good listeners speak, 40% of what they say is repeating back what the person said. And honestly, after doing these trainings, truthfully, it might even be 50%. But the truth is, at least 40% is going to be them repeating back what the person actually said, okay? And remember we said that when we talked about conscious listening? Well, that's exactly what it is that we're talking about. When we talk about repeating back what the person said, that's what we're talking about when we talk about paraphrasing and verbal mirroring, is that good listeners help the person that they are listening to know that they are on the same page as them by constantly repeating back to them what they are hearing. And so by repeating back to the speaker what they are saying, what happens is that the good listener does two things. Number one, it allows the speaker to know that the listener actually understands them correctly in the way that they mean to be understood. And then number two is that it allows the speaker to hear their own words back to them. And so the speaker can all of a sudden re-examine and clarify and go deeper on what it is that they just said. Because maybe what it is that they said, they didn't mean to say it in that way, right? Even though you're repeating back to them exactly what they said, all of a sudden when they hear it, repeated back to them, they're like, oh, wait a second, no, that's not what I meant. And then they can go ahead and re-examine and clarify and go deeper, okay? And so in this way, paraphrasing and verbal mirroring actually helps both the speaker and the listener to be able to facilitate effective communication. And so this is why it is so absolutely critical for you to know this skill as a coach and as a remote wellness practitioner. Now, does this concept sound familiar? It might sound familiar because we actually talked exactly about this same concept when we talked about curious exploration and the example of curious exploration about the why underneath the why, right? So if you remember, the curious explorer, the good coach, the great coach, what they were doing in this example was that every single time they asked a question, they would then paraphrase and verbal mirror back, right? So great, what you want is, and then they would repeat back what the person said, and then they would just go ahead and continue with curious exploration after that. And we had said, hey, this is a skill that you're going to learn later inside of this module, right? So every single time they did curious exploration, they had paraphrasing and verbal mirroring, specifically verbal mirroring, as we talked about. Typically in a coaching conversation, you're going to stick to verbal mirroring more than paraphrasing, so that way you don't diminish the words of the student. And so then they would go into curious exploration after that, right? And so they would do this over and over and over again. Curious exploration, verbal mirroring. It'll go curious exploration, then verbal mirroring. And so the reason why this might sound familiar to you is because we talked about this earlier, and we said that this was a skill that we were going to learn later on inside of this module. Well, guess what? That time has come, and now we are learning the skill of verbal mirroring. And so this is the power of verbal mirroring, is that this RWP coach used curious exploration to go 5 levels deep on the student's why. However, the coach would not have been able to do that if the student did not feel comfortable or understood. And so in this example, what's happening is that verbal mirroring is supporting curious exploration for this remote wellness coach to really unlock the true why behind what the student actually wants. And so this is what I'm trying to go ahead and explain to you, is that all of these skills work hand in hand because they are all a part of the conscious listening process. And so this is exactly why verbal mirroring is so important, okay? Is that it works hand in hand with the entire coaching process, so that way the student can feel understood, the student can clarify. It's not like you're going through this process and just asking a bunch of questions, and then the student doesn't feel like their questions and their answers are actually being heard or understood. And so on that note, that is exactly why I want to go ahead and now specifically highlight why verbal mirroring is so important. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about it. I've talked about it indirectly, but I want to go ahead and right now hit the nail on the coffin here with why verbal mirroring is important specifically and directly. Okay, is that we know that it is so important for the other person that we are communicating with to be able to feel understood and for them to feel heard. And so here's what you need to know. Verbal mirroring specifically, and paraphrasing, but again, remember, we typically use verbal mirroring more, is that verbal mirroring is some of the easiest ways to be able to help the other person relax and feel understood. Why? Because it helps relax their limbic brain and allows them to open up. Because when someone hears their own words repeated back to them, it's like a direct signal to their limbic brain that, hey, this person gets me, right? And as a result, because this person understands me, because this person gets me, because they're using my own words, it's okay for me to relax. And it's funny because students are going to say things like, wow, you really get me. Wow, you really understand me. And then in the back of your head, you're really thinking, man, you know what? All I did was repeat back to them what they literally just said to me, right? And so it's not that complicated. It's not that difficult, but it is so extremely powerful. And so when we use verbal mirroring in order to repeat back to the student what they just said, not only is it so powerful, but it also takes a load off of us as RWPs. And so it's a win-win, right? The student feels understood, and we did it so easily because all we had to do was repeat back their words back to them. And so what it does is it takes the load off of our shoulders. It allows us to not have to work as hard, because when we are doing this as a profession and as a result of having to talk to multiple people and helping multiple people go through their transformation, we need to be able to find ways that are win-win, that allows us to be able to keep up the stamina so that way we can help people through these processes. And so verbal mirroring not only allows the student to feel very well understood, but it also helps lighten the load on our shoulders, because all of a sudden we are not having to work as hard. And so the student feels awesome, we feel awesome, and that is an absolute win-win. Now, in regards to actually proving to you the point that the limbic brain loves to be able to be understood, it gets relaxed once verbal mirroring is actually used, I want to go ahead and show you a study to prove to you the importance of verbal mirroring specifically. Okay, so I'm going to show you a study here, and the study was done where they took the same waiter who was taking orders in a restaurant, and they told the waiter to either do one of two things. Number one, either just take the order and go to the kitchen once they got the order, or number two is repeat back the order before going to the kitchen once they got the order. Okay, so two things. Either take the order and then immediately just go to the kitchen, or take the order, repeat back the order, and then go to the kitchen. And so when the waiter just went to the kitchen without repeating the order, in this study, they found that on average, that waiter got 10% tips on average. However, when the waiter repeated back the order exactly the way the customer said it, they got on average 34% tips. Why? Because the customer felt that, you know what? This person understands me. They repeated back to me exactly what I said, right? How crazy is that? And you have to keep in mind here, not summarizing, not paraphrasing. We are talking about verbal mirroring. Exactly the same words that they used. Very, very, very important here, because that is how the person feels understood, and that way they feel heard. Very, very, very important, okay? And so that is just a study to go ahead and prove to you when you actually do it this way. And then you combine this with matching. So let's say, for example, I'm saying the words back in the exact same way. I'm saying the words back, the exact words that they used. And then I combine this with matching. So let's say, for example, I say this in the same speed. I say this in the same tone. I say this using the same body language. And so when I combine this with matching, all of a sudden I see, oh, dang, matching the nonverbal voice and the body language with the verbal mirroring, that's like the ideal scenario. Now we're actually talking about how powerful this actually is, right? What else? Why else is verbal mirroring so important? Well, exactly like we've talked about in every other training, because of the fact that verbal mirroring is a part of the conscious listening process, everything that we talked about conscious listening also applies to verbal mirroring, right? So it shows the other person that you understand them, that you care, that you're interested, feel heard, helps them feel understood, builds trust, builds rapport. And so when you use verbal mirroring, it helps the other person know that you are on the same page as them. And then on top of that, it avoids assuming that you already know. And this is another reason why verbal mirroring is so important, because good listeners are just observers. They avoid assuming that they know the meaning of what the person is that they are listening to is saying. And so through verbal mirroring, you can find out exactly what the student is thinking, feeling, or exploring simply by repeating back to them to make sure that you are understanding. And so when we apply that to the communication spectrum, verbal mirroring helps us uncover more of the meaning behind what the person is trying to communicate. Remember this visual? We talked about this. This is another evidence as to why verbal mirroring is so powerful and is so important. Now, with all of that being said, at this point, you might be thinking, okay. Now I understand what verbal mirroring is. I understand why it's so important, but dang it, how do I actually do it? How do I actually do verbal mirroring? So just like we have been doing in all of the other skills inside of the conscious listening process, we are continuing our theme of talking about what good listeners masterfully do. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about, okay, well, how do good listeners actually verbally mirror during a conversation? So remember, 40% of what good listeners do is they repeat back to the person what they heard. And the other 60% is curious exploration, which is asking questions. And so verbal mirroring is what usually happens between questions, okay? So what good listeners do in order to actually verbally mirror is they do 5 steps, okay? Step number 1, the good listener asks a question, curious exploration. The other person responds, step number 2. Step number 3 is that the good listener mirrors verbally, aka repeats their response back to them. So the good listener is checking to make sure that they heard and understood correctly. So example, so you're saying, insert the speaker's words, did I get that right? And then step number 4, what you do is you wait for confirmation or clarification from the other person. And then step 5, it can go one of 2 ways. If you receive clarification, no, I meant like this. Then what you do is you verbally mirror again to be able to clarify. And then if you receive confirmation, yes, that's what I meant, then you go ahead and proceed to the next question. Okay, so a couple different templates and scripts in regards to this. As you get better as a coach, you are going to find templates and scripts that work for you best, but here are a few that we commonly use. Number 1, so what I hear you say is, insert the student's words, do I have that right? Or number 2, so just to clarify, you're saying, insert their words, is that right? Number 3, hey, I want to make sure I understand this just so that way, I don't make any mistakes here. Are you saying, insert their words, does that sound right? Here's a number 4 here. Got it. So you're saying insert student's words. Is that right? And then number 5, plus, in addition to these templates and formats that we're talking about, plus in between, let's say you're teaching in some context, maybe you're texting them, you're writing to them, whatever it might be, what you can do is you can use their exact keywords and their exact phrases when we speak. And so even though we might not be saying, hey, did I get that right? Did I get that right? Did I get that right? And repeating it exactly back to them, we're still verbally mirroring when we are using their exact words in other contexts as well. Do you see how simple they are, right? It's very, very simple. And so just by doing these simple things, you have incredible connection with people. Now, the other thing you might notice is that how good listeners verbally mirror is that where was their opinion? Where was their advice? Where was the story that they were saying? Where was the solution that they were providing? Where was their own experience that they put in there? Where was the teaching? Where was the new information? It wasn't there, right? Because 40% of what they did is repeating back, and the other 60% was questions. And so verbal mirroring is the easiest way to be able to show someone else that, hey, you know what? I respect what you are saying so much that I'm actually going to use your own words in my speech. Specifically, when you go into more of like, hey, I am going to tell my experience now, I am going to teach, I am going to give new information, I am going to provide advice, whatever that might be, you can include verbal mirroring inside of that to be able to use the same keywords and phrases. And so as a coach, yes, we are listening to what the person is saying using conscious listening, but we are also listening to how they are saying it, aka the exact words, the phrases, and the keywords, okay? Now, does that mean that we are never going to share teaching experience and new information? Just like we just said right now. You are going to talk as well, but sharing those things is not going to happen during the time that you're in like coach conscious listening mode. But even when we do share those other things, we as an RWP are still going to be making the conscious effort to use the exact same keywords and phrases. So we are verbally listening within that entire context. Does that make sense? Very, very, very important to be able to understand how this actually comes together and how good listeners, how good communicators, how great coaches actually implement this skill inside of their communication. Now, another quick point on this is it's very important for me to go ahead and point out here is that using verbal mirroring to actually buy time as well. And so verbal mirroring is also an amazing way to be able to buy time as an RWP coach when you need time to think, right? What you do is you just repeat back what the student actually said. And so sometimes as a coach, you need time to think about what you curiously want to explore next. And so verbal mirroring, repeating back to them what they just said, gives you that added benefit, right? You don't want to only use it for that. You don't want to be slacking and not be thinking as well, but it gives you that added benefit in case you do need it to be able to have that time to think of what to say next by using verbal mirroring. So I just wanted to go ahead and point that out as a side note as well, okay? Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about in regards to verbal mirroring is some of the concerns that come up with verbal mirroring. Because when RWPs first hear that, you know what, verbal mirroring is all about simply repeating back the client or student's words back to them, they start to have some worries. And the very first worry that comes to mind is, hey, won't people notice? Like, man, is this like a thing? You're literally just saying the words back to them, right? It seems too simple, right? Won't people think that I'm weird? And here's the thing. The beautiful answer of this is that there's a power of verbal mirroring, is that most people in their life have never felt understood and have never actually been heard ever. And so when you are verbal mirroring, the person is so excited that someone actually finally gets them that they are not even paying attention that you are saying the exact same words back to them. But even if they are paying attention to this, it's just the fact that on their end, it looks like you are just making an effort to actually understand and hear them. Like this person cares so much about what it is that I am saying that they are literally repeating it back to me and then asking me if that's what I meant, right? And so for them, it actually ends up being extremely refreshing because of the fact that nobody has ever made that conscious effort for them before. And so that is the answer to the first worry about won't people notice? Sometimes they will. And in fact, they're actually going to appreciate that you are doing that, okay? Worry number 2, let's go ahead and address that. Worry number 2 is, do I have to write down everything exactly as the student or the client or the person that I am doing this with is saying? The answer to that is that usually your notes as an RWP coach are just going to be the words or the phrases that stand out to you or the ones that are commonly repeated, right? So few scribbles or few keywords that the student repeats over and over and over again. So you're not writing down every single word, you're kind of just stating and putting the keywords and the key phrases, okay? So you're literally not writing down every word, only the keywords and only the phrases, okay? Worry number 3, what if I verbally mirror and then the other person actually corrects me, right? And did I fail at verbally mirroring? Like, am I a terrible coach? What's going on there? The answer to that is that there are times when you verbally mirror and the other person adds on or corrects you. Guess what? Great, because being corrected is actually a good thing. And a lot of newbie RWPs will think, oh, but doesn't that break the trust because they had to correct me? Like I got it wrong. No. It actually strengthens the trust because when the other person corrects you, all you do is you just verbally mirror again with the new corrected understanding. And then the other person really feels like, dang, you really got me now. Right? And so they understand that what you are doing is you are truly listening. And so by them correcting you, it actually adds to the entire process and the interaction, and it adds in a good way. And so remember this. Being corrected can actually strengthen trust when you are verbally mirroring, okay? And so don't worry, at first, this might feel uncomfortable, but with enough practice, once you have the skill, verbal mirroring was gonna feel like second nature, and it is not going to be difficult for you to be able to verbal mirror what somebody is saying when you are listening to them in general. It's gonna be very, very, very easy for you. Trust me, you're gonna start using this in your personal life all the time as well, and then all of a sudden your personal relationships with your husband, with your wife, with your kids, with your spouse, with everybody, with your family, with your friends, it's going to get better because of the fact that you are learning these skills, not only professionally, but also personally. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Next up, what I want to go ahead and talk to you about when we talk about how to actually verbally mirror, I want to go ahead and give you a super awesome pro tip about suspending judgment when verbal mirroring, okay? Because here's the thing. Remember, good conscious listeners and great RWP coaches understand that their job is to make the other person feel heard and understood, even if they disagree with them. It is not our job to judge the person that we are listening to or their view of the world or their beliefs or any of that, okay? Our job is to understand where they are coming from so that way we can help facilitate their powerful transformation to be able to adjust what the identity and their beliefs and their character statements and all that kind of stuff is more empowering to where it is that they want to go. So they told us where they want to go, and all we're doing is facilitating that transformation. And so the thing is that when you judge the person that you are listening to, what it does is it destroys rapport. And do you remember how important rapport actually is, right? We talked about how it's the key to trust, and trust is the key to everything else in a human interaction, right? And so what we're going to do right now is I want to go ahead and go through a couple examples to show you how judging actually destroys rapport and how you absolutely want to avoid it. So let's go ahead and go through example 1, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and talk to you first about verbal mirroring as it is taught. So let's go ahead and talk about how a great coach verbally mirrors exactly the way that we talked about it. So the great coach says, hey, so Jane, what do you think about watching YouTube? And then Jane responds and she says, hey, I think YouTube is awesome. It's an amazing platform for transformation. The coach says, oh, okay, so what you're saying is that YouTube is awesome and it's an amazing platform for transformation. And then Jane says, yes, exactly, right? She feels understood, she feels heard. That is verbal mirroring as it is taught. But let's go ahead and talk about verbal mirroring gone wrong. And so this is where the amateur coach comes in. And the amateur coach asks the same question, hey, Jane, so what do you think about watching YouTube? Jane says, same thing. I think that YouTube is awesome. It's an amazing platform for transformation. And then the amateur coach says, well, I think that's your problem. YouTube is a distraction, YouTube melts your brain, YouTube is a complete waste of time. And now all of a sudden, Jane is defensive, she's offensive, and she doesn't feel understood, she doesn't feel heard, right? And so which one do you think is actually going to facilitate transformation for Jane? Because in the second version of this, where we talk about verbal mirroring gone wrong, if Jane was my student right now, she would shut down and stop answering my questions or become resistant and defensive. And how might this actually show up? Is that what would happen is that I would ask a question, right? And then she would be impatiently respond is, oh, I don't get what you're asking right now. Or she might say, hey, why do you need to know that? I don't think we're getting anywhere, right? And so the amateur RWP coach might think, oh, you know what? Jane, she's a bad student. When in reality, the rapport and trust was broken because of what the amateur coach actually did, not the student. And so the problem here is not the student. The problem is with the amateur coach. And so that's why when we talk about extreme ownership and we talk about literally you taking ownership for what is going on in the relationship between you and your students, what's going on in your business, what's going on in your life, we talk about really taking ownership of that. You realize that this happens in ways that you might not even notice, right? For somebody who is untrained in the sciences of coaching, it's very obvious. They'll say, oh, you know what? The untrained person says, yeah, the student's an issue. issue. Yeah, they always have issues. Yeah, students, there's just some good ones and then there's some bad ones. I'm telling you right now, it has to do with the problem with the coach. And that is ultimately the problem that is going on here, right? Does this now start to make sense, right? How cool is this? Are your eyes starting to get open about how fascinating all of this actually is? And when you actually look at doing this properly, about the difference in outcome that you can create in somebody's life when you actually implement these skills in a way that they are meant to be implemented. Let's go ahead and go over another example just so that way you can really, really cement this home for you so you can see how all of this actually works. Okay, so let's go over the same thing, verbal mirroring as it is taught, right? So the great coach says, hey, so Jane, I see that you are here with me as your wellness coach to talk about feeling fatigue and you've been really tired. Is that right? And then Jane says, yep, I've been so tired and I'm tired of being tired. And then the great coach says, okay, so what I hear you saying is that you're tired of being tired. Is that right? And then Jane says, yes, that is exactly right. And then if we were to continue the coaching conversation, we'd notice that her limbic brain is starting to relax and feel relief because they're like, oh, okay, someone gets me, right? This person gets me. They're in rapport with me. They understand me. And so as a result, she's willing to be able to relax and continue the conversation. But let's go ahead and look at what an amateur coach does and how verbal mirroring gone wrong. And so the amateur coach says, hey, same thing. So Jane, I see you're here with me as your wellness coach to talk about feeling fatigued. You're really tired. Is that right? Jane says the same thing. I've been so tired. I'm tired of being tired. And then the amateur coach immediately goes into curious exploration. Hey, are you sleeping at night? Have you tried taking naps? They continue to vomit questions. They continue to go through curious exploration, right? And then Jane, she goes, right? And then all of a sudden she starts to shut down. And so let's go ahead and really break down this example here. Is that as a coach, when a student tells you, hey, I'm tired of being tired, immediately a lot of amateur coaches, their response is to go ahead and start vomiting information and knowledge and all that kind of stuff. Well, we already talked about it. The knowledge and the information is already on Google. That's not your job, right? The thing is that you don't want to jump into curious exploration immediately in order to find out if she's doing what she needs to be doing. Because here's the thing. It's not that sleeping at night isn't a good solution for being tired. The problem in this interaction is that the coach jumped directly to asking questions and giving advice and curious exploration without taking the time to actually build rapport. And so if this coach had actually built rapport, had actually done verbal mirroring, and then went into the curious exploration questions, it would have been a completely different outcome. And so if you were to ask the student and you say, hey, Jane, what did you feel when this amateur coach actually started asking you a bunch of questions? Jane would probably respond and say, hey, I felt worried. I felt anxious. I felt like I was having to defend myself, why I couldn't sleep. I had to make the case of why I would totally suck because I'm not taking care of myself, right? And so because that rapport was not established, because that verbal mirroring did not happen in between the curious exploration, this is how Jane would actually feel. And so you can see what's actually happening is that this amateur coach is going in the opposite direction of where they want to go, is because Jane's limbic brain is putting up a wall. And so that way this coach is not going to be effective in actually facilitating the transformation for Jane. This is so eye-opening when you actually open up the hood and you see what is happening behind the scenes. When you start to audit your own personal conversations, your own communication that you are doing with your friends, with your family, with your spouse, with your children, you are going to see all of this in action. And it is that intangibleness. This is why we call it the art, right? It's the intangibleness, the in-between that is happening in the art of communication that allows you to be able to have the conversation in a different way. And all of it happens because of the fact that you are learning these skills of communication, okay? Let's go over one last example so you can really start to see all of this come together properly, okay? So example number 3, Jane says, hey, I don't understand this whole app tracking thing. I find it very tedious and I find it very annoying. The great coach, okay, so you're finding app tracking to be tedious and annoying. Got it, right? So that's verbal mirroring. And then the great coach continues, a lot of students sometimes initially feel the same way. Now, this is a little bit more of an advanced verbal mirroring that's going on here, right? There's normalizing, there's no judgment going on. And so it's literally taking verbal mirroring to the next level, and then they go into curious exploration after that. So the great coach is, hey, do you want to share with me a little bit about what specifically you're finding so difficult? And so they went to the next question, they went to curious exploration, but they did this in a way, it's kind of like, judo, if you know martial arts. And martial arts, judo is the science of using the other person's energy and not attacking them, but using their energy to redirect in a way that actually feels effortless. And so what's happening here is that initially an amateur coach might get really worried and scared and fearful. It's like, oh no, what's happening? Jane doesn't like app tracking, so I got to find a different solution for this person, right? They're finding it tedious. They're finding it annoying. That's not what coaching is, right? Coaching is about the transformation. And so there's like that judo element that's going on. You're taking that energy and you're going ahead and redirecting it. Okay, so I understand. You're finding app tracking to be tedious and annoying. Got it. Okay, hey, don't worry. It's okay. Don't worry. Sometimes a lot of students feel the same way, right? You're normalizing it. So that way it doesn't feel like an attack. And then boom, you're going back with another question. Hey, do you want to share with me a little bit about what specifically you're finding so difficult? And then she says, I'm finding it so difficult because of the fact that I actually have to take the food off the plate every single time that I actually put the food on the scale. And then you're like, oh, okay. So really it was because she didn't understand that there's a tare function on the scale. And so that's why she's finding it tedious and annoying, right? And so all of a sudden, rather than getting scared and fearful and changing her entire plan up, you're actually clarifying what the student means and what their actual difficulty is and getting more granular because you're verbal mirroring, because you're using curious exploration, because you're normalizing, you're able to successfully be an amazing coach and facilitate that transformation as a remote wellness practitioner. And so that's where here in the example number 3 analysis is that this RWP is practicing conscious listening, verbal mirroring, normalizing, no judgment, asking open-ended questions. And so remember, when we are in conscious listening mode, we don't have answers. We're not there to object or disagree. We're not there to react. We're not there to judge. We're not there to fix. We're not there to tell them they are wrong. All we are doing is we're allowing the person to feel heard and to build trust so we can understand what it is that they are saying and what their true difficulties actually are. So that way we don't misdiagnose. We want to understand exactly what's going on. And so in order to do that, we have to use these conscious listening process skills to be able to do this effectively. And just a side note here, right, is that let's say, for example, if this was an amateur coach and all of a sudden, let's say this student said, I find this tedious and annoying, and an amateur coach immediately jumps and says, okay, I'm going to judge this student in the back of my head, and she must be one of those students, or she's one of those people that finds it tedious and annoying, and she's one of those people who kind of just doesn't understand, or one of those people who is actually lazy. But that none of that might actually be true. The fact is that she just might not actually know how to do it, and all of a sudden you've judged. And so what you're doing is you're suspending that judgment when you are verbal mirroring, when you are consciously listening, when you are curiously exploring, so that way you can actually communicate with the person in an effective manner. And so when we gauge in verbal mirroring, we are letting the person know that they have absolutely been heard and listened to because we are using their exact words and specific phrases to them, right? And so now that you know what this is, the cool thing about this is that you can watch people who have been trained in conscious listening, and you will see that they use verbal mirroring all the time, is that they have been trained on how to actually build rapport. And you'll see this in people like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Ellen DeGeneres, or really anybody else who has actually properly been trained, right? When I talk about trained, they've gone through training like the way that you are going through right now in order to learn how to build rapport. And they do it for a living. And so you will see them do this all the time. Now, regardless of how you feel about those specific individuals, remember, you don't have to like somebody in order to learn from them, right? Is that we cannot deny that there are millions of people that actually know, like, and trust these masters of rapport. Why? Because these masters of rapport have actually consciously trained on this skill, and they actually use it consciously in the same way that you are doing right now, and the same way that you are learning this skill. And so with these examples, you're starting to get a glimpse into what is actually going to make your coaching and your transformation sessions so effective, and why you are going to be able to charge $1,200, $2,400, $3,600 plus for them, because you understand all of the things behind the curtain and under the hood that allows somebody to facilitate the transformation process. Pretty cool, huh? all of this, I can't tell you how much I love to geek on this kind of stuff, really going into like subconscious communication and influence. It's so very interesting to me. And it really is the behind the scenes, under the hood type of things that allows you to take your coaching to the next level. And I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to be able to go ahead and transfer that knowledge to you and then give you the opportunity to put in the reps and the action for this. So that way you can acquire these skills and it can really transform your life as well. Now, with that being said, as we start to close out this training, I do want to go ahead and talk to you about self-coaching and verbal mirroring, because like we talked about, is that many of these coaching skills can actually be applied to ourselves via self-coaching. And so verbal mirroring is actually one of those skills as well, right? And so in the same way that you would use verbal mirroring with someone else that you are listening to, when you are using verbal mirroring on your own thoughts, you can also mirror your own words back to yourself. And so good self-coaches use the 5 steps of verbal mirroring on themselves. Yes, I know it's kind of meta, but let me go ahead and walk you through how this might potentially also actually work, okay? So how this happens. Step number 1, the good self-coach asks him or herself a question. Curious exploration. Step 2, the mind responds. Step 3, the good self-coach mirrors back, either through writing or through journaling or sometimes even talking out loud to themselves. They mirror back the response. So they'll say, hey, okay, so what I am saying is, fill in your own mind's words back to yourself. Is that right? Is that really what I believe? Right? Then you can curiously explore from there. And so the self-coach holds and suspends judgment in the same way that you would hold and suspend judgment from somebody else that you are consciously listening to. You hold and suspend judgment about your own thoughts and emotions. And you allow yourself to explore those thoughts and ideas and emotions without judging or being quick to criticize. And so it's like being able to play devil's avocado with yourself. Yes, I know it's devil's advocate. I actually like to use the word devil's avocado. So yes, you can play devil's avocado with yourself to go back and forth and say, okay, is this really what I believe? Is this perspective really true? Is that really what's going on here? Is this really what I'm saying? And so you can clarify, curious exploration, verbal mirroring. You can actually go back and forth with yourself as well. And then step 4, wait for confirmation or clarification from self, right? And so if you receive clarification, no, actually, you know what? This is what I actually think. And then you go ahead and verbal mirror back to yourself and clarify. Or if you're like, yes, that is what I think. And then you go ahead and proceed to the next question. Now, I know after hearing that, you might be thinking, say what? Talking to yourself? Genius. And so, yes, I know it sounds a little bit meta. I know that talking to yourself might seem a little bit like multiple personality disorder, but I promise you that self-coaching is a thing and is extremely powerful when you actually learn these skills. And these are just a few examples of how we can use verbal mirroring when we are coaching ourselves to be able to clarify what we are saying and listen to our own thoughts and emotions better. And so good self-coaches clarify their mind and go back and forth with themselves using devil's avocado in order to actually be able to clean their thinking. I call this cleaning their thinking. And so that way you can not have a dirty thinking. I don't mean in the perverted sense. When I mean clean their thinking, meaning that it's very clear what it is that they are thinking, what it is that they are feeling, what their ideas are. It's because they've actually massaged them. They've actually gone through them and cleaned it up. So that way it's very straightforward and it's very, very clear. Okay. And so too many people are scared to even just listen to themselves. They're too scared to even repeat back their own thoughts to themselves because they're too busy running away from their thoughts in fear. But the thing is that when you actually use verbal mirroring to repeat back your words, all of a sudden you can clarify exactly what it is that you mean, and you can actually communicate more effectively, not only with yourself, but then when you start to clarify and communicate these ideas to other people, it's very succinct and it's very clear what it is that you are trying to say. And so a good self-coach knows that it's important for themselves and their personal development to mirror back to themselves what they are thinking and saying, so that way they can hash out exactly what they mean. And that is how you have a very clean mind, very clean thinking, because you've actually processed it, okay? And so they help themselves mirror back to themselves, whether that be through journaling, whether that be through thinking themselves, or even if they are having a conversation with somebody else, else, right? Sometimes in my life, I sometimes am an external processor. And so I have people in my life that I process with. And so what I'm doing is I'm verbally mirroring my own thoughts as I'm talking to these people in my life that I call processors. They're people who are like in my advisor board, right? They're people in my life that are either mentors or friends that help me process my own thoughts and emotions. And so what's happening is that you're exploring your own thoughts and emotions by using verbal mirroring. It's so powerful. It's so important. And I'm really excited for you to learn this skill so that way you can use it as a self-coach on yourself as well. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Really, really awesome. As we start to close out this training, let's go ahead and talk about what's next. Okay, Coach Yassine, this is all great and all, but what happens next? Well, ladies and gentlemen, well, boys and girls, this was only the knowledge piece of this skill. And so remember, skill equals knowledge times reps. And so we got to put in the action in order to actually acquire this skill. And this is where the skill session is going to come into the picture. And so in the very next training, we are going to practice both matching and mirroring and paraphrasing and verbal mirroring in a skill session, which is going to be skill session number 2 in terms of building rapport. So that is going to be in the very next training. And so to go ahead and close out this specific training, let's go ahead and talk about your engagement question. We would love to hear from you. Hey, I thought this training was mind-blowing. I thought this training was amazing. I thought this training was whatever. Let us know. Hey, this training for me was fill in the blank, right? What did you like and enjoy about this training, right? What specifically did you like and enjoy about it? And what were some of your biggest takeaways or ahas from this training? Remember, we love to hear from you. It is so important for you to be able to cement these concepts in your mind as well. That's why the engagement questions are there. And then finally, let's go ahead and talk about your action steps. As always, inside of Module 4, they are very straightforward. Number 1, watch and study this training in full. And then number 2, complete the engagement question for this training. I'm super pumped that you are learning the knowledge behind this skill. And then very soon, when you start to actually implement it, when you actually get the action in, when you actually get the reps in, it is going to become an invaluable skill in your toolbox as a remote wellness practitioner, as a coach, as a human being, as a valuable asset to the human species because of the fact that you now know the skill of verbal mirroring. And so with that being said, this is Coach Yassine checking out. I will catch you inside of the next training.